In less than a week, Nigerians will gather at polling stations across the country for the 2015 presidential elections. The electoral process have undergone reforms in the run-up to the election. My guest will be looking at Nigeria's preparation for the 2015 general election. And welcome to the program this week. I'm Gloria Umezuke. The Independent National Electoral Commission has extended the deadline for the collection of the permanent voters card. Now, that's one of the steps taken by the Commission to ensure that the process leading up to the election is hitch-free. Well, this week's episode of the program will be analyzing Nigeria's preparation for the 2015 general election. Now, my guest is the Deputy Chief Observer of the European Union Election Observation Mission in Nigeria. But up ahead, amidst calls for the postponement of the 2015 general election, human rights lawyer Mr. Femi Falana, a senior advocate of Nigeria, has called on Nigerians to resist those calling for the postponement of the election.
As time ticks for the general elections, this forum between INEC and observer missions is intended to harmonize activities of observers to assess INEC's readiness for the polls. At the meeting, human rights lawyer Femi Falana urged Nigerians to resist the moves by some groups and individuals calling for the postponement of the general elections.
As far as the Constitution is concerned and the Electoral Act, the duty of fixing the dates for election is vested exclusively on the INEC. Therefore, any attempt, directly or indirectly by certain anti-democratic forces to untwist INEC or blackmail INEC not to hold this election must be fought by all of us.
Some observer groups also expressed concern over the level of distributions of the permanent voters' cards ahead of the polls.
The free flow of distribution has been a challenge of the PVCs, and it's only, I would even say, in the last week that INEC has confirmed that all of the permanent voters' cards that should be distributed in the country is available and is being distributed.
But INEC insists that progress has been made with preparations for the polls.
We had done over 24 states before the last quarter of 2014. The remaining 10 states is where we are having these challenges. For most of those 24 states, bulk of this PVC has been distributed, over 70%, in some cases 80%. The crisis we are having now with distribution is for the last 10 states. And even among those last 10 states, the biggest crisis that we are hearing, well, the cries and hues are from the large states of Lagos, Kano, Imo, Ogun, and Oyo. The other smaller states from this last phase have gone over the issue. They've distributed over 70%. In fact, Kaduna is the last phase. They did their CVR well after Lagos, yet they have distributed up to 80% of their PVCs.
Nigeria is going to the polls to elect their leaders in about 10 days' time. This remains so, even though some groups are calling for a postponement of the elections.
Well, joining me now to expatiate on this issue, which has so many sides to it, is Mrs. Anna Roberts. Well, Ms. Anna Roberts, you're welcome to the program.
Thank you. A pleasure to be here.
Well, at times like this, during election periods, we usually have observers coming in to do, observation matters and all of that. And this is not the first time. This is certainly not the second or the third. What exactly is the your main mission here, towards this elections?
Thank you. First, to say we've been invited here by the Nigerian authorities. The EU doesn't just turn up. We have to have an invitation in order to come. And the reason why we come is to look at the election process and make an assessment of how we think it's gone and also to make recommendations for future elections. So the idea is that by being present, we can in some way maybe deter some malpractices, as people know that there is somebody watching, but also we can help give an informed expert opinion on the process and can make these recommendations so that future elections in Nigeria can get better and better, we all hope.
Now, do you get some satisfaction when you come in? Because the last elections, you know, the EU was here as well, and they made certain recommendations which you complained that they were not used, you know, the way they ought to have been used. So, what sort of satisfaction do you get from this?
So, after or during any election observation mission, the EU will make a number of recommendations. Some of these will be to do with election law reform, to the way the election administration is working, to do with the media, the parties. In the case of 2011, we made 50 recommendations. We're still in the process of assessing how many of these have been implemented, but we know for sure that some of them haven't, the ones to do with changes in legislation. We're still seeing if the others
Some of them are majority of them.
Some of them are to do with changes in the legislation. So we're still assessing the others to see to what extent they've been implemented. And we're also, of course, looking at new issues arising. In terms of the satisfaction that we get, I think for all of us come for a reason. We all enjoy this work. We all enjoy being part of hopefully helping people's democratic rights be honoured. And in some way the European Union can do this by being an external presence that is here assessing the situation and, as I say, making these recommendations.
Now, the most important thing is for your recommendations to be taken and implemented and all of that. But when it doesn't happen, do you feel you're still making any impact at all?
I think we all have to try. Situations change, and we've seen over the years in Nigeria that elections have changed. So there's reason to think that they will change again in this election and in the future. So we all want to be part of, in some way, helping improvements happen. And it's for that reason that we come, that we want to be here. The EU wants to show its support to democratic growth in Nigeria, and we as individuals want to be part of that.
So specifically, what were the major recommendations that you had and you feel they should have been adopted even before now?
So we made a number of recommendations that involve changes in the legislation. One has been adopted, that's the Freedom of Information Act has been passed since the last election, and of course that's positive. But there are a number of other ones that are still to be implemented. They're all available on our website if anybody wants to see, but they include things like the possibility for people to run as independent candidates, or for INEC to have more powers in regards to accepting candidacies.
So is that the two major recommendations you have?
Those are just examples of some of the 50 recommendations that we have. There's also a number that are to do with the election administration, so to do with the way that INEC organises itself, its transparency, etc., and others to do with the media, with the political parties, etc. And we'll be making fresh recommendations after this election. Every election is different, so we need to see what the issues are now in this election and then think about what improvements there could be in the future.
Would you tell us your observations so far? At least you've been here for a couple of weeks, if I may say so, and you have seen what's on ground and what ought to be, what is not, you know, and all of that. What's your general perspective on it?
So we've had our long-term observers out in the field for 2 weeks now. They've been assessing the situation on the ground. We're still in the process of assimilating this information, of working through it, and also the election is ongoing at the moment. 2 days after the election day, we'll be making what we call a preliminary statement, which will be a public assessment of the election so far. The election will still be in progress then, so of course our final report will be a more complete document. But at this stage we're still in the process of gathering and working through the information that we have, and it's only after the election day that we'd be giving our full assessment of the process so far.
Okay, right now the major issues also include the fact that INEC hasn't distributed the PVCs yet, you know, to a lot of people, a whole lot of people. You know, do you see this affecting the elections?
Of course it's important to see who's enfranchised for an election. We always hope that the maximum eligible people will be able to cast their ballot. But an election's a difficult thing. It involves a balance of giving maximum enfranchisement and also securing the integrity of the process. We know that INEC is making efforts to promote the integrity through the use of these biometric measures, the electronic card readers and the PVCs, but also trying to get people enfranchised through the distribution of these cards. There are still days left now, so we hope that INEC and other stakeholders will do the maximum that they can to promote the distribution and the collection of these cards.
You know, so another major worry really is the internally displaced persons. And of course, we have them in several countries. I'm sure you have observed this as well in other countries in situations like this. Is this really a huge, you know, a stumbling block for us?
Of course, as observers, we want every voter who's eligible to be able to cast their vote. And of course, it's very difficult in the case of IDPs because they are away from their home location. So it's a challenge for any election administration. It's particularly challenging here given the security issues, etc. We know that INEC is making some extra measures on this, and we know that it's been speaking to the parties about this, and now we need to see how this works in practice.
But if you see the number, about a million people displaced, and we're not too sure that a large number of them would cast their votes, would participate in the elections. What sort of crisis do you think we're in?
So of course all of these individual votes are important, but also politically it will depend in part on the extent of the results and the degree of the margin of victory that there is during the elections. But whatever the results, every single vote of course is important in an election, and for maximum efforts to be made to uphold the right of citizens to be able to cast their ballots.
Now, given your previous observations, you know, in the past in other countries, you know, what's a striking difference here? And
so every election is different. It's very hard to compare. It's like comparing apples and pears. But there are certain characteristics in Nigeria. Of course, it's a very hard country to run elections in. It's got an enormous geography, very diverse people.
Is that why you say hard?
It's a difficult country in terms of the terrain, so it's a challenging operation for any election commission to run an election in a situation like this. And of course we know this is a very competitive election, which means there's extra pressure on the election authorities.
Tell us about your experiences so far in your observing mission.
So during this mission in Nigeria, so there was an advanced team that were here looking at the primaries. And then the full team came in early January. So we set ourselves up, our core team, as we call it, where we have a number of dedicated experts. So one looking at the legal framework, one looking at the political environment, one looking at the work of INEC, another looking at the media. Then, a week or so later, our long-term observers arrived. These are a group of 30 observers coming from the EU member states and also from Norway and Switzerland, who we trained up here in Abuja. And then they've gone out across the country, working in teams of two, always two internationals from different countries. And the purpose of them is really to be looking at the ground realities of this election. It's not enough for us just to be in the capital, and not enough just for us to be reading the laws and regulations and hearing what the authorities say. We need to see what happens in practice. So that's why we've spread our people out to different places around the country so they can see what actually happens. So when they're out there, they're talking to as many people as possible. So they'd be looking at the election administration, talking to the parties, civil society, the media. They'd be going to different campaign events where possible. They'd be seeing for themselves what's actually happening.
Can we know how many observers you have, you know, doing this? And of course, I understand that you might not be going to the northeast.
Yes, at the moment, we're not able to deploy to the northeast because of the security conditions that there are, which means that the EU can't undertake its long-term methodology. The EU won't just observe on election day. It has to observe for weeks before and weeks afterwards, because an election is much more than just casting a ballot on election day. There are many different aspects to an election. And unfortunately, the security conditions are such that we've assessed that we're not able to do that long-term methodology in the northeast. So we will be located in other parts of the country, and we will still be following what's happening in the northeast, but we won't actually have our observers on the ground, but we will still be in some way following and watching.
So how many observers in total?
So at the moment, we have approximately 40 people on the ground, 40 internationals. That includes our chief observer, who's a member of the European Parliament, Santiago Fischer. He comes and goes from Nigeria, as he has parliamentary commitments also. back in Europe. So there is him plus the team that is in Abuja and the 30 observers out on the ground. In addition, over election day, we will be reinforced. We will have some members of the local diplomatic community who will be joining us. So those are diplomatic staff from the EU member states and Norway and Switzerland who are joining us in this work. And they will come and work with us to go and look at what is happening with polling and collation. And furthermore, we will also have 7 members of the European Parliament who will be joining our mission and some staff with them. So in total, on the first election day, we should be over 90 people present in the country.
Interesting. We'll take a break right now. We're still with the Deputy Chief Observer of the European Union Election Mission in Nigeria, Ms. Anna Roberts. We'll come back again on more on how they intend to go about observing these particular elections. Just stay with us.